Hello, welcome to Revenant Reads. I'm Vin, and today I'm giving book recommendations for people interested in horror studies, books that focus on looking at the silent horror film. Now, before we get into a conversation about the books that I'm recommending, we should probably talk about that sort of anachronistic term, silent horror film. Uh, Horror films, as we know it, they were not called that until the 1930s, until after the Universal monster horror cycle had been kicked off. Filmmakers who were making macabre films, sometimes they'd be referred to as weird films. They didn't use that word horror. That's not to say, though, that they weren't making movies with the same basic intention as people later on. They were making disturbing pieces, films that were meant to evoke negative emotions in the viewer, okay, which is pretty much how I view what it means, what the horror film is all about. We also don't want to look at earlier horror films as though they're simply predecessors to what would end up becoming the true horror film in the 1930s. That's not really how we want to look at it. We should look at them on their own terms, and want to study the progression that they went through, and also how they end up influencing later films. Now, if you're somebody who is interested in horror and has never watched a silent horror film, or maybe you've only watched something like just Nosferatu, that's one that even horror films that have an aversion to silent films will sometimes watch. There are some amazing silent films. They should not really be avoided, in my opinion. First of all, they weren't actually silent. If you went to a theater to go and see these films, there would have been music playing, sometimes sound effects. You would not have been watching this film in silence. That's one misconception to get over. And secondly, there was a tremendous amount of creativity in silent films, partly because they didn't have to worry about sound. You didn't have to worry about, the sounds of fans or machinery or anything else that's going on right off where the camera is. And you can have wild scenes being played out right in front of the camera. Something like if you look at a Faust, films that have these dramatic scenes that are just often amazing. They're beautiful, and things that you could not do in the 1930s because of sound. If you watch Todd Browning's 1931 Dracula, that's a creaky film. That's got a lot of sounds. You notice that there's no music playing. They weren't quite sure how to work that out yet. And it shows. They had to worry about sounds on the stage, all quiet on the set, and it does affect it. I think that the horror films, I'm using that term anachronistically, of the 1920s, at least many of them, such as The Phantom Carriage, there's quite a few of them. There's terrific. A lot of them are actually superior to what we end up seeing in the 1930s, I think. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. So anyway, after that kind of rambly introduction, let's go on. Okay, so my first book that I would recommend, again, these are books about the silent era, okay, about silent horror, okay, that are meant to study. The first one I'm recommending is a general popular history. Silent Screams, The History of the Silent Horror Film by Steve Haberman. Now, Steve Haberman has, I think, since gone on to earn a PhD, I believe, in might be film studies, but he is somebody who is a fixture of a lot of special features on Blu-rays, commentaries, things like that, a lot of classic horror films. So he's certainly recognized as an authority within the industry. And this was something he wrote a decent amount of time ago. Let me see if I can actually find the date in here. 2003. Okay, so it's getting close to 20 years ago. But this is a solid introduction. It doesn't go into intense detail about a lot of it. It doesn't go into a lot of theorizing or anything like that. But if you want just kind of a solid background into silent horror, this is actually a pretty good option. It's popular, it's non-academic, but it's still really good. The first academic work that I'm going to recommend is a book that I love. This is Gary Rhodes, The Birth of the American Horror Film. This is from Edinburgh University Press. And this is a treasure trove of primary sources. This deals with horror films from around 1890, 1896, around there, to around 1910, I believe, if I remember correctly. Kind of before you end up getting a lot of feature-length silent films. So this is like the first 15 years or so. And he goes into the background, pre-film, where some of the things, the different cultural aspects. We've got, literature, theater, different visual culture, with some great images. When he gets to the chapter on witches, like he'll go through witches as they were understood all the way up through the 1800s, right? And what context viewers would have been going to see movies about witches, right? In the late 19th, early 20th century. And then he goes into the different films that were made and what they were like and, what we know about them with just so many images. So this is, and he's got notes galore. That is nothing but notes on there. At the end of every chapter, there's just a sea of notes. So incredibly well documented. Here's a whole thing on death, murder, and executions in silent horror films. Here we go. Picture of a hunchback. So anyway, I think that this book is just absolutely terrific. I loved it. Especially if you're somebody who really appreciates primary sources. This is wonderful. I really like this one. Around the same time period, okay, that we're dealing with, I got another book here. This is Murray Leeder, The Modern Supernatural and the Beginnings of Cinema. And this gets broken up into a couple different sections. He's once again looking at the very beginning of horror cinema. And the contents are The Haunting of Film Theory, Light and Lies, Screen Practice and Supernatural Magic. One of the ones that I thought was really interesting, here we go. The Aesthetics of Co-Registration, Spirit Photography, X-Rays, and Cinema. He's got a really good chapter in here about how X-rays were basically birthed at the same time as cinema. And for a very short amount of time, they were competing entertainments. He talks about how people, first seeing their X-rayed hands or the bones, how many of them felt like they were seeing their own death. And then how that accounts for the proliferation of skeletons that we see in early silent horror films. Anyway, this is from a Palgrave Macmillan, a very short work. You can read it very quickly. Again, we still have some images here. But yeah, this is more like a collection of essays than one kind of complete monograph. But still, there's still some really interesting information in this one. And then we start moving into post-World War One. This is mostly dealing with the 1920s. A Place of Darkness, the Rhetoric of Horror in Early American Cinema. And this is from the University of Texas Press. Kendall Phillips, okay? And what this looks at is how horror was treated in the 1920s. There's a very interesting thing that happens, especially after World War One, where American horror cinema and European horror cinema take two very divergent paths. European silent horror becomes much more psychological. They embrace the supernatural, and a lot of it has to deal with madness and insanity. And in contrast to that, we have the American cinema, which was kind of very much on purpose trying to be anti-European. Whereas the Germans become very expressionist, the Americans double down on realism. And we start getting, in our own country, in our own cinema, horror spectaculars, big budget horror films, like with Lon Chaney. You got The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which isn't quite horror, but it's kind of almost, you could almost argue, some have, that he's kind of like an early Universal monster, predating even The Phantom of the Opera, but certainly Phantom of the Opera in 1925. And those sorts of horror films dealt especially with physical deformities and trauma. And that's probably a result of World War One. People coming back maimed. So whereas the European cinema focused on the psychological impact of the war, American cinema tended to kind of focus on the physical cost of war, amputations and things like that. So if you watch Lon Chaney films, he's often playing amputees or he's playing people who are deformed, and that really goes a long way. And the supernatural is almost always, it is always explained. We don't have any real supernatural horror films in American cinema really until Todd Browning's Dracula. Instead, we continuously have something that you think is maybe a haunting, but then it is revealed at the end to not be so. So that is very much the American way of dealing with things. Now, we start seeing a convergence, though, towards the end of the 1920s when you have more German filmmakers coming across and making films. You start seeing some German expressionist influence inside American horror films, starting in the late 1920s and certainly into the 1930s, where it kind of starts chipping away at what Americans were willing to accept as far as the supernatural within their films. So that's really what this kind of deals with, the American approach to horror films in the silent era. If we want to look at the other side of things, at least in part, the next book is Wasteland, The Great War and the Origins of Modern Horror by W. Scott Poole. And this one's from Counterpoint Press. And this is a very entertaining book. Poole looks at World War One and how it impacted the arts. Horror cinema certainly plays a large role in this, but he also looks at things like painting, literature. H.P. Lovecraft gets some treatment in here as well. How did the war, with its, again, the human cost, the psychological cost, all of that, how did it ended up playing a part in the creation of the horror genre? And I don't know if the book ever really goes into how it was created, but it certainly does a great job of looking at the impact and how it influenced the arts at the time. So I highly recommend this one for looking at the way that World War One affected the horror genre. Even if it didn't create modern horror necessarily in this book, it certainly affected it. The last one that I'll recommend is a book that really is more looking at transition. And that is Uncanny Bodies, The Coming of Sound Film and the Origins of the Horror Genre by Robert Spadoni. So this is about the transition into talkies and how that transition is not smooth. There are two periods in which cinema is uncanny to its audiences, where it is kind of weird and disturbing and not right. And that is when it first came out in the late 1890s. People weren't quite sure what, there was kind of a ghostly quality to cinema, a haunting quality. And it happens again, they get used to it, but it happens again when they switch over to sound. Because often the sound, if you're watching these early sound films, sometimes the sound doesn't quite line up with what people are saying. Sometimes, you're hearing it just from a speaker over in the back of the room or over in the corner, and it doesn't quite look right or sound right. So there are two times when you really, in horror cinema history, even film history in general, where people are acutely aware that they are watching cinema and that they are not being, kind of drawn into the story and accepting of it. And that is also at the time when you start seeing the horror genre come around. So we could never repeat the way Todd Browning's Dracula was first viewed. It was in a completely different context, to a completely different audience, completely different technology. So what we might see, again, I kind of mentioned this before, as a creaky, stagey film like 1931's Dracula, it would have been very odd and uncanny to people who first experienced it. Really, it's like the first real kind of true talky horror film. And it also had a supernatural aspect, which American audiences weren't used to in their cinema. So yeah, if you watched Bela Lugosi's Dracula today, you might think Bela Lugosi's kind of cool, but it's definitely not going to scare you. But back then, it was a completely different context in which people viewed. And it didn't just have to do with people being afraid of vampires. It had to do also with the transition into sound cinema. So this is kind of a nice end cap to a study of silent horror films. So anyway, if people are interested in looking at silent horror more seriously, I certainly recommend it. I think that it's an area of horror studies, and an area of horror fandom that is terribly neglected. You're talking over 20 years of some really amazing creative cinema that I think more horror fans should certainly seek out. So anyway, just once again, the books that I'm recommending, we've got The Birth of the American Horror Film, it's hard for me to read that there, The Modern Supernatural, right in the beginnings of cinema, A Place of Darkness, Wasteland, Uncanny Bodies, and then the popular history Silent Screams. All right, so anyway, hope people watch some more silent horror. So happy viewing. All right, thank you, BookTube.